Hello, everyone. This is the 87th episode of the Soccernostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. And I am joined by Paul from Shipley in England and the 1888 Letter blog. For this episode, we continue our interview series with Professor Aldo Mazzucchelli as we discuss the history of Uruguayan football. Mr. Mazzucchelli is an Uruguayan author and football historian, as well as a university professor at the Universidad de la República in Montevideo and formerly at Brown University in the United States. He is the author of Del Ferrocarril al Tango, El estilo del Futbol Uruguayo, 1891-1930. We aim to have a series of interviews with Mr. Mazzucchelli where we will examine the history of Uruguayan football. For this interview, we look at Uruguay's 1930 World Cup win. Hello, Aldo. Welcome back. It's been a while.
Hello. Yeah, it's been a while. Okay, welcome. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you.
Again.
Of course.
Thank you for joining us again, Aldo. Could you just start us off by discussing the background to Uruguay being chosen as the host of the inaugural World Cup in 1930?
Okay. Well, it's a kind of a very complicated background because it's unusual, and it was unusual back then, that Uruguay would be selected to host the first World Cup, FIFA World Cup. I've been going through it again, to refresh my memory about it. And it's amazing how complicated it was. I don't know how much detail the audience would be interested in knowing, since this happened, like a very long time ago, and there are a lot of small things that were part of the decision. And it's a very, I would say, paradoxical decision, since it was taken unanimously at the Barcelona Congress of FIFA in 1929, but then practically no team outside America, outside South America and North America, would really accept coming, and it was very difficult to get the four European teams that finally made it to the tournament to decide to come. So how come? No, if it was unanimous, then we suppose everyone was, decided to assist. So in order to explain this, there are, different, as I said, different angles that one can mention. There are an angle related with sport per se, and the prospect, of making a very long trip in order to face again, Argentina and Uruguay, who were, I would say, undisputedly the best teams of the time back then. And that was one thing that kind of was put into consideration. Then there was the internal discussions inside FIFA between, I'd say, this what was called the central countries back then. So countries in Central Europe plus Italy would be considered part of them. So Austria, Czechoslovakia, who were like real important football, teams back then, and national teams. Germany was independent from that group, but also could be considered there. Switzerland would be considered there as well, and none of them would really want to make the trip. From the very beginning, they started, like I would say, working against the cup, even though they had voted for it. And then I'm going to explain why. And then the other bloc, not bloc, but the other important forces in FIFA would be France, of course, Belgium, to some extent, Spain, Sweden, of course, the Netherlands. And each of them would have their own agendas. So this is a second thing that was important at the moment of the voting, because in order for the other bloc not to win, you know how it happens many times that in order to block your enemy, finally a third party would win the thing, and this was the case in some way. So Italy blocked the France, idea, and France would want as well to block the central countries and Italy, etc. So that was one of another factor. A third factor that was, I would say, important was that, we all know this is important for the history of football, because you know how the relationship between FIFA and Great Britain was very complicated, right? Back then, it was even more. England would not be part, or none of the in the islands, none of the countries would be part of FIFA, and they had left, and there was a kind of not very hidden competition for the control of the administration of world football. So the Football Association and England in particular would be, not very well disposed about all these new countries coming in and having some power, at least sports power in the field, because and even at the level of the administration. So this is a third thing that played a role. Even from outside FIFA, England, sent some messages. Things were published in the press, etc., in order to diminish the importance of the tournament in South America. And so we can refer to these things in more detail. But back then, I would say there's a very nice book by Peter Beck that is called "Scoring for Britain," and it refers to international football in this period. And Beck makes the point, I think, very strongly, that by the 1920s, more or less, so in the period between wars, finally the British government realized, or accepted the idea that football finally was an important, played some relevant, I would say, role in the international image of nations. So, which was previously, it was an idea that was dismissed by the government, but back then they started to accept that and include that, I would say, in the projection of the image of the country. And so this idea was not appealing to Britain, the idea that football would be that international, let's say. There's so that's another angle, another factor. And then there was, of course, another one, a fourth one, that is that there were a couple of championships, tournaments planned to occur that very summer. One in Switzerland, not national teams, but clubs tournament, and then a national team cup to be played by Czechoslovakia, Austria, Italy, etc. And these very important football countries back then would prefer to prioritize this tournament and not make the long trip to South America. Finally, of course, there was, I think this was used in order not to come to Uruguay, was the factor of how much would be paid to each player and to each national team, and what would be included, So the money factor, even though Uruguay paid a lot of money, and precisely the proposal, the Uruguayan proposal at the Barcelona Congress was supported mostly in a financial project that was the biggest one, because the country in Uruguay adopted, the government adopted the cup as a national, let's say, project. while in the other countries it was a project of each football association, not backed by the central government. So Uruguay was ready, prepared to offer a lot of money, and actually that was what happened. The European delegations got a lot of money coming to Uruguay, but they were, negotiating more and more and more, and delaying the inscription to the very late moment, even in June 1930. So only 1 month before the tournament, France, Belgium, France, Romania, and Yugoslavia confirmed they were coming. And then there was Egypt, who was negotiating to the very last second. And finally, they decided to come, but it was too late. So they would make it to the ship, to the ship in Genova. I think that was where they were supposed to board it. So they couldn't make it, and they wouldn't participate. So this is more or less, not entering much detail, the 4 or 5, factors were at play. And finally, the cup was enthusiastically, I would say, backed by the US, by Mexico, and by all football federations in South America. And then, just to remind people, there were 13 teams participating. So these teams I mentioned from America, and then so from South America you had the footballing nations, because the north of the continent would not play yet football. So you had Brazil, Argentina, you have Chile, Paraguay, Peru, Bolivia, Mexico, and the US. I think these were the teams who made it, plus, Uruguay, and then the 4 Europeans I mentioned.
Now, why were Uruguayans so keen to host the World Cup to the point of underwriting the traveling costs of all the participants? Is it perhaps because the tournament was supposed to be like a centerpiece for Uruguay's centenary of independence?
Yeah, of course. So let's say, how did this start? The idea. So the headline is, yes, it was 1930 was 100 years of the Constitution of Uruguay, the signing of the first constitution of the country. That happened in July, on the 18th of July, which is one of the national, days for Uruguay. So the concept was having Uruguay won 1924 and 1928 Olympics that were equivalent, let's say, to World Cups, considering the teams participating, the centrality it had in the Olympics, etc. So Uruguay considered it was prepared to make, a proposal to FIFA to organize this and connect the national celebration with the FIFA World Cup. That was proposed by 2 persons from Club Nacional de Fútbol, one of the main teams in Uruguay, Nacional, and it was accepted by the National Association in Uruguay, Asociación Uruguaya de Fútbol, and then that was proposed to the Confederación Sudamericana, let's say CONMEBOL now, immediately accepted and backed by CONMEBOL, especially by Argentina and all of them. They all realized that it was a good idea. Uruguay probably would have a chance to be accepted. And so they went all together to the Congress with this proposal, and all decided to back it. And then, of course, this is very important, the US backed it as well. So adopted, the idea, and was actually verbally defended it in the Congress. So you had this bloc, let's say, the Western, let's say, bloc, backing the idea. And then, many things happened in the Congress. I don't know if it's interesting to go into the minutiae, but there was a strategy, basically, that was conducted by a very important guy in the resolution of this, that was Enrique Eduardo Buero, who was actually a Uruguayan who was the vice president of FIFA by the time. So he had a voice there, and along with Jules Rimet was one of the two main, one of the important. No, there were many others, but some others, but he was one of the big guys, let's say, in FIFA. So this was the guy who conducted the strategy, like trying to conduct the discussion in order for the Uruguayan proposal to be approved. And finally, when Italy was expected to make its case and propose there was in very fast, I could say, first the Uruguayans managed to eliminate a financial proposal that would put the cup in Europe, that was brought by France and others, and then everything went into a commission. The commission worked, and they went back into the general meeting. And when Italy was supposed to make an alternative proposal, Italy withdrew its proposal. So Uruguay was the only proposal standing. So it was proposed to be voted. An Argentinian delegate, Horacio Becar Varela, who was very ill, very sick and very prestigious back then, made a very, emotional, I would say, discourse, etc. So it was that moment, and it was proposed the Uruguayan initiative to be voted, and it was approved. But then, as I said, everyone worked in Europe against it. So it's very, very curious how it happened. But basically, that was it.
Despite the generous gesture that Uruguay had made, as you've said, many European nations were still reluctant to participate. They cited the time, the distance, and obviously many of the other political factors that you've mentioned already. But this snub would have repercussions for the following World Cups during the 1930s. Can you describe how this was viewed in Uruguay?
Well, of course, it was very difficult for Uruguay because, to begin with, there were some months that it was not apparent to Uruguay that basically Europe was conducting a boycott to the cup. I have a colleague, Pierre Arrigui, who wrote extensively on this, along with other researchers, and he makes strongly the case that there was a conscious boycott. Okay, I think there are reasons to say that. Anyway, so the first 6 months, have in mind that this was voted in May of 1929, so we had 1 year and a couple of months more before the starting of the tournament. So Uruguay had decided to play it very big. So decided to build the Estadio Centenario, that I think is well known by now for everyone, which was the very first 100,000. It was not 100,000, but the original project was 100,000 people stadium outside the British Islands. Was the first one of that dimension. There was nothing comparable in continental Europe or the US for soccer, for football, and that was built in a very short time, in 8 months, six months more or less, and it's still there, working. It's a FIFA monument, historical monument, and so the country invested a lot in the project and supposed or expected that at least Italy and Spain, they were, linked by blood with Uruguay so closely because of the huge immigration coming to Uruguay from Italy and Spain in the 19th century and the beginning of 20th century, would be present, that both countries would be present. When they realized that Italy was, delaying everything and not saying anything clear, and that Spain, even worse, decided secretly not to come, but would not communicate that. How Uruguay realized this was a big shock that happened in our summer, so along, I think, January, February of 1930. The Uruguayan directors, the committee here, received a letter that was filtered by the Catalans to Uruguay, where the Marqués de Someruelos, who was like the head of the Spanish Federation, was sending private letters to all the local, football associations in Spain, recommending not to accept. So it was to be voted to whether they would come or not to Uruguay in Spain, and recommending everyone to vote for no. And that was secret. So when the Catalans communicated this to Uruguay, it was horrible, right? So the impression, and it was a shock. And then by that time, it was already all the alarms were ringing, because it was only 5 months for the initiation of the tournament, and there were no European teams enrolled. So anyway, finally, when Argentina was very strongly supporting Uruguay and even calling for a boycott to Europe and getting out of FIFA, all South American countries and American countries getting out of FIFA, etc. So there was some pressure from this side as well. But finally, Uruguay decided, we're going to do it whether you come or not. So even if we have to do the first World Cup only with American teams, we are going to do it. And that, plus some very high-level negotiations with Belgium that involved, commerce and other, background that was related with the governments of both countries, decided the Belgians to say yes. And finally, when the Belgians said yes, another government-to-government negotiation made it for France to make that France decided to come. And then you had two not very footballing important countries like Romania, maybe Yugoslavia as well, decided to come. And this is at the very first second was decided. So for Uruguay, it was like a shock on the one hand, but on the other hand, finally the thing happened, and it was acceptable, like the first World Cup. And I think now it entered history as the first World Cup. And you can argue that Argentina and Uruguay were the best footballing expressions outside Great Britain, and so inside FIFA, because Great Britain was not in FIFA. And but it is true, nevertheless, that probably the 5 more stronger, European teams, national teams, would not participate, did not participate, and this, it's a sort of a stain to the cup. Italy, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Austria, Germany, and the Netherlands. So these 5 teams were very, very powerful, even though all of them had played Uruguay. Most of them had played and lost to Uruguay and to Argentina. So this was more or less the thing. Uruguay tried to connect football with a national identity in a very open way, not in a, I would say, in a sort of how can I say, in a very clear and open way. And I would say that played the cup played a role in the final, split between Argentina and Uruguay, because there were so many historical and cultural connections between both countries. Uruguay actually historically could be considered part of Argentina that was separated at some point because of different factors. I don't think we are going to enter into that now. But for sure, Great Britain played a big role in that. And but there were many links, familial links, friendships, connections in terms of culture, etc. And the trip between Argentina, but Buenos Aires and Montevideo would be always like one night in a boat. So you could go to sleep in Montevideo and awake in Buenos Aires and do your day there and then come back. So it was very simple, very, very easy to connect both countries, and this connection worked very well. And it was common to get married in Buenos Aires and get your friends there at your wedding, etc., or the other way around, etc. So at some point in 1930, after the Cup, I would say that it was like a breaking point for that kind of dynamics. And even though there are, even now, very strong cultural links, and we share many things with Argentina, we consider brothers, but something changed in 1930, and incredibly, football was was a factor in that. So it was as if Uruguay would, reach the total independence, I would say, in 1930, in some symbolic sense. This probably is one of the more interesting things in terms of the history of the Cup. And then, as you said, both Uruguay and Argentina, decided the connection with the European football on the basis of what happened in 1930. So Uruguay would not go to 34 because of the previous boycott. So Uruguay decided, being the champion, not to go defending its title in 34. And then politics played a role in 38 as well. So they decided not to go either. And then, cups were suspended because of the war, as everyone knows. So 34, the 30s would not have Uruguay. And there were some Argentinian players who played in 1930 for Argentina who would play for Italy in 34, so I think we could mention in passing the world crisis, the economic crisis. 29 was a factor as well. That was cited especially by Austria, saying we really cannot make it because we cannot lose our jobs or our day jobs here in Austria, going 2 months or 1 month to the other side of the world, etc. So that, I think, was a reasonable argument. I don't know how much that was the real reason, but it was cited as well. And the football professionalism, that, as you know, we discussed this, and it's well known that amateurism versus professionalism was one of the main, I would say, axis for the conflict inside FIFA or between Great Britain and FIFA, etc. And as I think we discussed in previous podcasts, it was completely professional. Football was professional in South America and in the River Plate area already in 1915, or so, more or less, and before. So that was the arguments about being amateurs, not being able to participate, or we cannot lose our job, etc., are disputable. Even in Europe, where it was professional as well. So there was money involved in football, even though nobody would declare that openly, but that was the case. So this is how things happen in the preparation, but we can discuss, I think, how the tournament went and what happened after, because especially between Argentina and Uruguay, that is the main outcome, of the thing.
Now, you mentioned about Montevideo's new Estadio Centenario. Can you discuss the around-the-clock construction of this stadium? And you mentioned it was finished within 6 to 8 months, and in fact, it was not even completed when the tournament started. So,
exactly.
Can you explain the whole process of this construction?
Yeah, well, the scheme is simple. So there was a project that was this is interesting, that the how can I say, the city was in charge of building the stadium by the government. So the city government simply took the resident architect, I would say. So the guy who was in charge of the architectural projects of the city officially, let's say, the guy working at the city council, and he Scasso is his name. He was a very good architect. He planned the stadium with a plan that is kind of oval, and that was like an innovation for the time, because stadiums would be normally built a square, around the field. So it was an Art Deco project with a tower that is still there, and it's very iconic, I would say, and with some wings. It was projected that it would have like a statue of a victory, a kind of similar to the Victoria de Samothracia in Greece, like kind of that. And there's a lot of symbolism included in the tower, etc., representing modernity and 100 years of Uruguay Republic, etc. And the original project would have one more ring, so 100,000 people. And this guy, with the resources of the city, so, and then they hired some more, like workers, and they had about 1,000 workers working around the clock, 24 hours. So they had 3 shifts, and they had a few practical problems. So the Uruguay had to complete its own capacity of building, concrete, because it was not possible to build all the concrete for the stadium in the time that was available. So they had to buy some concrete from the outside, from Germany, was bought and brought to Uruguay. And then they decided the place, and it was this was the construction, and as you said, by the time it was planned that the tournament would start on July 13th, finally, because it was calculated that the Centenario was going to be ready for that date, and every match would be played there. And what happened is that it was very rainy, and it's the winter in Uruguay, July, midwinter. And so finally it was impossible to get to finish the thing, and for the cement to be, I don't know the word, but fraguado, so stable for the people to use it. So it had to be decided by the very last time that the inauguration of the stadium would be postponed, and the first 5 or 6 or 7 matches of the tournament were played in Parque Central, that is Nacional Stadium, and in Pocitos, that was Peñarol Stadium, the other big team in Uruguay. So the thing had to be changed, and adjusted. And finally, the Centenario was inaugurated on July 18th, so the very day of the Constitution celebration. And it was madness. So it was so incredibly packed with people. There was resale of tickets, and so there were much more people than allowed, apparently by the engineers, and nothing happened. But the opposition tried to use it politically in Uruguay and say that the stadium was going to fall down, and on the very day of the inauguration, etc. Nothing happened. But if you see the photos, that there's many photos and film, etc., of that day, it was incredibly packed. So it's black with people. Every place where you could put somebody in the stairs, on top of the walls, everywhere, it's people. It's like so from that day, 18th of July on, every match was played in the Centenario Stadium. Joe Rimet actually praised it very highly, saying that there was nothing like that in the world back then. etc. So it was an accomplishment, I would say, that building. And yeah, so this is how it happened. There was a lot of discussion about the resale. Is that how you say? So you buy a ticket and you resell it for more money, and that was the state tried to to persecute that, but it was not easy. And of course, being Argentina so close, and when people from Buenos Aires would come like in massively to support their team, and also to the final that was played between Argentina and Uruguay. So that was an extra factor. I think Uruguay would have filled it anyway, but that was an extra factor to make sure that the assistants were big for all the matches, I would say. Most of all, not all, but most of them.
Can you describe Uruguay manager Alberto Sapici and explain his exact role in preparing the team?
Yeah, well, as you know, back then there was not the figure, of the mister, as the Spanish would say, Spaniards, the director técnico, as we say here. So that role was not would not work like now, like it works now. In Uruguay in particular, I don't want to extend this to other teams, but in Uruguay in particular, the clear figure was, there were like three concepts. You had the direction of the Asociación Uruguaya de Futbol, who would make the political decisions, and finally make the designation of the players by a commission that was a technical, commission deciding who was going to make it into the team, not into the field, but yes, into the group, right? So this is one thing. The second concept is you have the capitán, the captain of the team, plus the more senior guys would discuss tactics, who was going to play, etc. So the group itself would make the decisions about tactics and about who's playing in discussion with this commission. And then the third, there was a figure, a kind of entrenador, there was the name, who was designed by the commission and would discuss. But the players and the captain were very, very central, in all the decisions. And I think that's an interesting thing, because it would, if you think it now, it could conduct to discussions and fighting inside, etc., for who's playing, etc. But if you have a team that is well established with clear, like footballing hierarchies, etc., it works. And then the third figure that was very, very important for Uruguay was the physical trainer. And this guy was playing a role even in 1916 and even before. So Uruguay always, I would say, even from 1910 and even at least from 1910, would have a physical, like the concept of physical training, like very central for the team. And this never changed. So the idea of having athletes on the field was central. Nobody could play if it was not fit, it was not, fast, etc., etc. So even I would mention that one of the main discussions in 1930 was that players felt that the physical trainer back then, Alberto Supici, was making them train in a way that was not conducting to their flexibility. So they discussed this, and they changed the players, make the trainer, so discuss with him and get him changing at the very last week of the before the tournament, or even after the first match. The final discussion was set that they stopped doing some things, some walkings, etc., that they consider they were their muscles were hard, and not flexible enough. So there was a discussion. There were discussions of this sort, and and they played a role. And if you see the reports of Asociación Uruguaya de Futbol in 1924 and 28, you have all the biometrics and all the performance of each player, with tables, etc., speed, etc. So it was central to back then, no? Because people think sometimes that that was not important, and that's a mistake. It was really central, explicitly so. So the team, the Uruguay, one main headline would be the Uruguayan team was basically, the basis of it was the same of 24, 28. So there was continuity, even though there were some renovations in some positions. And Argentina, on the other hand, had a very young team, very strong, but new, with considering, some players of 28 would be there, but the main structure of the team was a new one. And Argentina felt that now they had like the real great team that was required in order to win the cup. So there were very high expectations in Argentina. I would say they always have high expectations. It's a a part of the national identity to be very optimistic about their prospects in Argentina. But back then they were justified, as many other times. At that time it was justified. So this played a role as well, because there was a huge disillusion and disappointment with the result of the final. So it was the old guys from Uruguay beating the young, guys from Argentina. So
I was just going to mention that whether he was the trainer or coach, whatever title, Sapici has been credited as the youngest man to guide a team to the World Cup. He was only 31 at the time.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. For Uruguay, national gymnastics and physical education was a big thing. As for other countries, but in Europe especially, but Uruguay adopted these politics in the 19th century, following Great Britain and Germany. There were two different schools, of this, and it was a lot of money from the government put in public places for sports in education, including the curriculum, etc. So it was. I think that was part of the success of Uruguay, clearly. And Sapici was, very young guy. And he was established in that realm, let's say, of the state and physical education. So he made it to the national team.
Now, describe the Uruguay's preparation schedule for the World Cup, as well as the famous incidents that led to the dismissal of the starting goalkeeper and double Olympic winner Andres Mazzali.
Yeah, Andres Mazzali, because he was a French family, but the last name sounds Italian, but it was coming from France. He was the goalie, for Uruguay in 24 and 28, a national goalkeeper, and very experienced back then, and he had his own technique. He was an innovator in some ways, using his hands especially. You remember that back then the forwards could how can I say, could hit or use the body against the goalkeeper in the area. That was allowed by the rules, and it was considered like the goalie would not keep the ball for a long time in his hands. He get it and immediately, launch it to some other player. So Mazzali, even though he was not very very tall, but he played basketball, and he was as well a 100-meter sprinter at an Olympic level, and competing in South America in tournaments, etc. So he was quite a figure, and he got married at the beginning of the year in 1930, but apparently he loved women very much. So at some point, there were two episodes connected. So Peñarol wanted its goalkeeper Capellini to be included in the team, or to be the goalkeeper, saying that Mazzali was already, his time had passed and had to be renovation. And the group formed in 23, 24 was very strong and cohesive, and it was difficult to get out any of the central players. Especially, I think I'm deviating a little bit here, but especially some discussion was around Jose Leandro Andrade, that made the scene in Paris and was very famous. He was very sick. Actually, he had syphilis and contracted syphilis in 25 or 24. In 24, probably in Paris, but in 25, he realized he was sick and he went under treatment, etc. But his football abilities would diminish, even though he still managed to play in 28. But for 1930, it was very difficult for him to play. And he only made it to the team because of his name. But there was a huge discussion and even some violence, I would say, in Uruguay, because other players outside of the group would want to make it in the position of Andrade, because everyone knew that he was not able to play. Actually, he did not make a very good cup, especially in the final with Argentina. Anyway, so there was this aspiration of putting a new goalkeeper in the place of Mazzali. That was one thing. And the other one, he met a girl, a few days before the tournament started, when they were already in the concentration in their place, they were gathered and waiting for the tournament. And he got out of there unseen, and then would return like a few hours later. So somebody, told that to the managers, and they decided to expel him out of indiscipline. So there was a huge discussion. Some players said that they would resign if Mazzali was expelled, etc. But then no way, he was expelled, and the Peñarol keeper was put in his place. So, but finally, this was not the guy who played. The other goalkeeper, that is called Ballesteros, who was from Rampla Juniors, another team in Montevideo, would be the goalkeeper of the team in every match. So that was a huge thing for the public, etc., because Mazzali was one of their references, of the team. But I think the anecdote is interesting because it shows that discipline was, applied and shown, to show to the people and to the other players. And even though the captain, etc., were against this, they could not prevent that from happening. So finally, there was another goalkeeper in the national team.
Ahead of the tournament, was there an expectation that Uruguay would win, given that there were, as you mentioned, so many players who played in the winning Olympic teams of 1924 and 28? I think Nasazi, Petrone, Scarone, several players who played in both tournaments.
Yeah, Sea. Well, there are a few curious things to realize. First of all, this was the first time that Uruguayans would see their national team playing at the World Cup level, right? Because back then, anybody a few of them could have traveled, especially to Amsterdam after the team was a success already, in order to go to see them playing. But how many? So it was very few people in Uruguay who had actually seen them. So the expectation was huge. And that played a role. Even some players said, well, this was the first time we were really nervous because now we had our own audience, and in the numbers of 70,000, and all the newspapers that were huge number of them in Uruguay, in Montevideo, especially back then, commenting, and judging and criticizing, etc. So playing a role. So public opinion would be much heavier on them in 1930. This is one thing. The second one is, as usual, the competition between main teams in Uruguay was part of the menu, I would say. Who's going to play? Why my players are not playing this position, that position? These guys are old already. We need the renovation, etc. That was part of it, not very central, but was part of it. I mentioned the goalkeeper, and there were other positions where there was discussion. So the players who actually made it into the field would feel that pressure, right? They had to deliver because they were being seen, watched very carefully. And then what else? Well, and then you have the debut that happened on July 18th. The day the Estadio Centenario was inaugurated was with the match between Uruguay and Peru. That was the first match played by Uruguay in that World Cup. Peru was already played with, I think, Romania, and Uruguayans had, of course, gone to watch that match. Were not very strong, so they said, "Okay, we are going to win. This is an easy thing." But this didn't happen. So the match was very difficult for Uruguay. Uruguayans played bad. Apparently, they felt it was muddy. The field, so the field itself was not stable yet. It was, as I said, finished at the very last minutes, last second before the match, so it was not ready yet. So these factors played a role, and Uruguayans complained that they wouldn't be able to do their passing game, etc. So it was very difficult for them. And they won 1-0 with a goal of Manco Sea. Manco is one-handed guy, right? So Castro, sorry, Manco Castro. So Héctor Castro, who was this guy who had lost a hand because he was working, I think, as a carpenter, and lost a hand. And he was a very strong player, very good player. And he made the first goal, actually, of the Estadio Centenario and of the FIFA World Cup for Uruguay. And Uruguay won 1-0, but nobody was happy. And the papers were cruel, actually. With the team, they said, well, this is horrible. We have no chance. And most of the papers were very, like they are now. In order to sell papers, they would go to extremes, etc. So there were some very good commentators back then, but these kind of emotions tend to drive judgment. So people were expecting a lot, and they didn't get that from the match with the estadio packed, etc. So it was some kind of a big disappointment, the debut. But so that was the beginning of the tournament. Then things would change, and at the same time, everyone was with the other eye watching Argentina, because everyone expected that Argentina and Uruguay would make it to the final, which of course happened. And that started creating some friction, because, for instance, the first Argentine match was against France, and France had a decent team, and it was very, very, very hard for Argentina to beat them. It was a strange match played at Parque Central in Uruguay, where the referee, out of nervousness or nobody knows what, but he finished the match 10 minutes before full time. and somebody made him notice that he had made a mistake. So they returned to the field and finished the match, but it was odd, right? So, and it was apparently a kind of violent game, especially on the side of Argentina. So they would resort to violence at some point. and the public rejected that, with whistle, etc. So it was booing, the Argentinians, etc. And finally, the public, the Uruguayan public, mostly went for France, and that was not very well taken by the Argentines, who said, "Well, we are brothers, or what? You have to be with us, etc." And so the papers in Argentina, this was going to be a very big factor, because Argentina was in a social and political turmoil by the moment of the Cup for different reasons, economical reasons, political reasons. Hipólito Yrigoyen, the then president, was on the last, times of his career, and it was kind of a weak leader back then. He had been a great political leader, but was, the things were going south for him. And there was actually a military coup in preparation, and some newspapers played, a role in inflammating the public in Argentina. It was very clear, especially one periodical that's called Crítica. It was a very popular periodical in Argentina, with many editions over the day, with a huge readership. And actually, the director of Crítica was a Uruguayan guy who had emigrated to Argentina when he was young, and was very nationalistic in a almost insane way. So Crítica would cover, the Cup, and other papers as well, from a very, very, very ultra-nationalistic point of view. So we cannot lose, we are superior, blah, blah. And this didn't help, right? So if you read the papers from Argentina and Uruguay, the Uruguayan side was much more pessimistic and not very nationalistic, I would say, at least not in this overt way. And there were other, chronicles from Chileans, Paraguayans, Peruvians, etc., who can be read. And so this is something that gives you like a more objective, I would say, impression of the tournament. But I made the point in my book, etc., that reading the Argentinian papers, especially some of them, some were wonderful. Very La Nación, for instance, or La Argentina, were very objective and serene, calm, watching the football, the technical aspects, etc., very interesting. But others were playing a different tournament, like an internal political tournament, inflammating people in order to sell more as well, of course. So acted like some tabloids, very, very, how can I say, sensationalistic, or so. This was part of the thing, and played an important role in the tournament. So I'm mentioning this because it was central, really. So Argentina played France, and then the second match of both was different as well, because Uruguay played Romania, who was very weak, a very weak team, and not even a national team. It was like a company who would put together a team, and the king, sent them. I think it was a British company in Romania who made for most of the players, who provided most of the players, and Uruguay, that was like a show. And Uruguay made a few changes, put some new guys in some positions who would remain, like Pablo Dorado, who was a lefty playing on the right wing position, and Juan Pellegrin Anselmo, that was like a dandy. Personally, he was a dandy, and also in the field. And he played only a couple of matches. Very, very, very good player in the position of Petrone, who would get out of the team and not play again. And then you had Scarone in his original position as a right insider. He was always the magician, I would say, of the team. He was the best, and played a great tournament as well. In 1930, it was very important. Sea in the left insider position. So that was and then Lorenzo Fernandez, who was the center half, as great player as well. He had went to play for Peñarol already, as well as Lorenzo Gestido, who was like the left wing, left left back, who played for Peñarol as well. So there was some renovation and some continuity, and I think that helped. So Romania was beaten like very easily and with a lot of nice playing. So people, as usual, went from this is horrible to this we are the champions again already. So both were wrong, but this is what happens. Argentina, on the other hand, had to play Chile, and Chile had been playing with Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil for years now, and they had a medium, medium level team, I would say. But the problem is that game was very violent. So there was a general fighting between all the players, because at some point Subiabre, who was the crack, Chilean crack, was suffered a foul by Monti, who was the Argentinian captain, a veteran. He played in 28, etc. So he was reference for the team. And then they had a discussion and Monti wanted to lift him, and Subiabre punched him, and then there was a spark that opened like a general fighting in the field. This is told by the referee, was Langenu, who finally, the Belgium who would make the final. He was the referee at that match, and he tells everything in his own memoirs, of the tournament, which are very interesting, and an important source, of information for this. And he said, well, I did nothing because I had to expel the 22 players. So I waited, and for some seconds, there was this usual turmoil, and then finally they calmed down and they kept on playing and nothing else happened. But it was a violent game, was going a violent game when this started. So, and then the incident of Argentina being violent happened again against the US. And in particular, there are very strong, press statements by the US team because they played the semifinal with Argentina, and they had a guy had a broken leg or something, or a very serious injury, and a couple more Americans had to leave the field in mid-time. So it was very, very tough, to say the least, the playing, and Argentina finally won 6-1. But that was at the very end of the match. As usually happens, some matches are very difficult up to some point, and then when the match breaks, the other team makes one goal after the other. But that was the case. And actually for Uruguay, Romania was very easy. Peru was not easy, difficult, etc., but passed. And they, in the semifinal, they played Yugoslavia, and that match had some polemics about it. At the beginning, Yugoslavia made 1-0, so the whole stadium was concerned with that. But finally, there was a discussion about one goal that apparently the ball got out, was an out ball, and was returned to the field, and the referee didn't notice. So Uruguay made a goal. It's not clear to me. I tried to check all the press and cannot reach a final clear point. Anyway, Uruguay finally won 6-1 as well, and so they were both qualified for the final. And that was obviously the main thing in the tournament was the final, right? The preparations for it and how it went and what happened after.
Yeah. So let's take a closer look at the World Cup and the Uruguay national team. So for the tournament, we have the following players. As goalkeepers, we have Enrique Ballestero of Rampla Juniors and Miguel Cappuccini of Peñarol. As far as the rest of the team, the captain is the legendary Jose Nasazi of Bella Vista. We have Domingo Tejera of Montevideo Wanderers, Jose Andrade of Nacional, Lorenzo Fernandez of Peñarol, Álvaro Ejido of Peñarol, Santos Urdinaran of Nacional, Héctor Castro of Nacional, Pedro Petron of Nacional, Pedro Cia of Nacional, Santos Iriarte of Racing Club de Montevideo, Ernesto Mascheroni of Olimpia of Montevideo, Pablo Dorado of Bellavista, Héctor Scarone of Nacional, Juan Anselmo of Peñarol, Miguel Melonio of Bellavista, Emilio Recoba of Nacional, Zoilo Saldombide of Montevideo Wanderers, Juan Carlos Calvo of Sportivo Miramar, Conduelo Pires of Nacional, and Carlos Seco of Peñarol. And you kind of went through the matches on July 18th. They defeated Peru 1-0 with Castro scoring the 60th minute. And that was the day of the opening day ceremonies at Estadio Centenario. And like you mentioned again, it was after this match that the players felt they basically complained about the physical conditioning of Supici, and some decisions were made, as you mentioned earlier, about future trainings, and also some changes were also made as far as team personnel against Romania. And so Tejera, Urdinaran, Castro, and Petron were replaced by Mascheroni, Dorado, Scarone, and Anselmo. And so, like that match on July 18th against Peru, you have Ballestero, Nasasi, Tejera, Andrade, Fernandez, Hestido, Urdinaran, Castro, Petron, Cia, and Iriarte. And against Romania a few days later on July 21st, you mentioned Uruguay comfortably won 4-0. And Dorado scored in the 10th minute, Scarone in the 26th, Anselmo in the 32nd, and Cia in the 35th minute. Everything in the first half. And the lineup then was Ballestero, Nasasi, Mascheroni, Andrade, Fernandez, Hestido, Dorado, Scarone, Anselmo, Cia, and Iriarte. So there was a more balance to the squad following this match. And as far as the semifinal, Uruguay would win 6-1, but there would be complaints by Yugoslavia because either of officiating and the incident you mentioned with the ball was out and allegedly it was kicked back into the field before one of the sequences to the goals. And so this match 6-1 again at Centenario on July 27th. We have Cia scoring a hat trick, 18, 67, 72nd minute. Anselmo scored twice, 20th and the 31st minute, and Iriarte in the 61st minute. And Yugoslavia had taken the lead from Vujadinovic in the 4th minute. And again, you have the standard lineup: Ballestero, Nasasi, Mascheroni, Andrade, Fernandez, Hestido, Dorado, Scarone, Pellegrino, Cia, and Iriarte. So now we come to the final. And obviously, that's been discussed through the decades. We know Uruguay would win and become the very first champions, defeating Argentina 4-2. So there's the legend about each team want to play with their own ball in the beginning of the match, and so that's become part of the legend. I guess it's hard to determine whether it really happened or not, but Uruguay would win. Dorado would score in the 12th minute. Argentina would take a 2-1 lead in the first half through Pucel and Stabile. And then Uruguay would storm back in the second half with Cia, Iriarte, and Castro scoring for a final 4-2 win. And again, the lineup is Ballestero, Nasasi, Mascheroni, Andrade, Fernandez, Hestido, Dorado, Scarone, Castro, Sia, and Iriarte. So yeah, so Uruguay became double Olympic champions and now World Cup champions at this point.
Yes. Actually, there's a change in the team in one position between the semifinal and the final that is relevant to mention. That is that Pellegrin Anselmo, the center forward, would not play the final. It was Héctor Castro, El Manco Castro, who played the final, right?
Yes.
As you mentioned. This change was made because Pellegrin asked not to play explicitly. And why? He said, well, this is not going to be a football match. It's going to be war. I'm not ready for this. So please put some other player who is more, up to it. And why this happened? Well, of course, because the atmosphere before the match was very charged because of the press, fundamentally because of the press, role that I mentioned. And so it was high competition. If you see the context, you realize that, first of all, in 24, first you have that Argentina and Uruguayan football would create each other, let's say. So playing against each other for years and years, ever since the 1880s and 1890s, but especially from 1900 on, when national teams and local teams would be more, the modern local teams would be established in both sides of the river. You had three cities, Rosario, Buenos Aires, and Montevideo, Montevideo and Buenos Aires, the more important ones, but Rosario was an important footballing city back then already. The three cities would create like a dynamics of continuous playing, okay? So the style of River Plate football was created by the three cities and by players who known each other very well. It was 2-3 generations of players already having taken part of this dynamics. And since both countries were very passionate about football, obviously, and they adopted the sport, and it was like a feature of the national identity for both already, for the national culture, I would say. And the fact that Uruguay made it to 24 and won created like a precedent for Argentina that, because of the internal division, was not able to go. Even Uruguay was divided, as we discussed previously, when Uruguay decided to go anyway to 24. So part of the country, the footballing country, would not go to Paris, only the other half went. So Uruguay won, and that was a big hit for Argentina to some extent. And they said, okay, but if we had gone, we would have won. So they made it to Amsterdam in 28, to the next Olympics, and they made it to the final. And it was not one final; there were two finals, because the first one was 1-1. A tie that nobody was able to break. So they had to play again, which was very welcome by the organizers, because they sold out the stadium twice. And Uruguay won with a Scarone, famous goal in 2-1. And so Argentina recognized, very clearly that best team had won, etc. So there were no problems on the surface, but of course there was a huge rivalry between both of them. So when Argentina made it to the 1930 final, and they had the final in the neighborhoods, let's say, and many thousands of Argentines could cross the river and make part of it, etc. It was like the moment that Argentina had thought could finally win, and like at least balance the shit, let's say. So as I said, especially nationalistic newspapers in Buenos Aires, especially because of the political atmosphere, would play a role and create more of a like a more charged, let's say, atmosphere for the final. And in there's another factor that will play a role as well. That is, Argentinian Federation was divided, heavily divided, ever since the 1912. And there were a couple of three, like split schismas, as we say, splitting between the two factions that would organize their own tournaments, etc., and fighting for the control of the money, basically, of football in Argentina. And by 1930, they were reunited, but the factions were still there. And one of the factions was the head of the delegation, the Argentinian delegation in Montevideo. So the rivals in Buenos Aires were waiting, like saying, okay, how do you make it in Montevideo? Are you going to win? Because they decided what players would go, etc. So it was an internal division still at play in the Argentinian Federation. All these things played a role. The Argentines felt, like the pressure of playing, and the Uruguayans as well felt it as well, as I said, because they were before their own publics. So it was difficult for many players. Even Monti, the Argentine captain, said he was not going to play, and he was like forced to play, let's say, so convinced by the other guys, etc. So finally, the match started. There was also another factor, that is, the tickets were sold in Buenos Aires, thousands of them. So Argentines had to cross the river in order to assist the match. That was played on a Wednesday at 2 p.m. And it was decided to play it at 2 p.m. because it's winter, so light is there up to 5:30. Then you have no more light. There was, of course, no artificial light available. So they decided that if there was, a supplement, they had to be able to play it. So what happened is that a dense fog installed over the area, and it was impossible for many of the ships coming from Buenos Aires to make it to Montevideo. They had to anchor in the middle of the river because there was no visibility at all. And many of the Argentinians who paid their ticket or was hoping to make part of the venue were not able to make it. They had to hear on the radio what happened, which was pretty depressing for them, of course. And then anyway, the stadium was packed with the people that was present in Montevideo. And you have two things. And well, I devoted a lot of research to this because it's really the one of the nucleus of the history. It's what really happened that day in the final. So what I'm gonna say is connected with what both Argentine and Uruguayan papers reported, and with what Chilean and Peruvian, especially in Chilean journalists and some Paraguayans as well would report. So my synthesis is the match was normal. Nothing strange happened. No special violence, no special. Well, there was one play that was disputed. That was the second Argentine goal in the first half was allegedly an offside. The Uruguayan said it was offside, and that raised like a dispute, reclamation by Nasasi, the captain, directly to the referee in the dressing rooms in the 15 minutes between times, and this is it is told by the referee. So I read this from the referee and from other sources, from Nasasi, etc. More or less all of them say the same. The linesman, who was Christophe, a French referee, didn't see offside, and so didn't call it, and the referee just followed him, and this is all. I mean, Nasasi swears that it was offside, that he stepped forward and left offside the Argentine forward, but who knows? Anyway, this is the main contention in terms of place. Then there are couple more things. After the match ended, we can now go through the match because it's interesting what happened, but just to finish with this point, after the match ended, the Argentines stayed in the field, made part of the final ceremony where Uruguay received the cup, etc. Went to the hotel, and then went to the harbor and get the boat and left to Argentina the next day. Up to that point, papers from Argentina and Uruguay would not say anything about anything strange in the match. Then, when they arrived to Argentina, they wait a couple of days or one day, and then in August already, I think it was the 2nd of August, the final was on 30th of July, 30th. The head of the delegation, Augusto Ruquet, the head or one of the main delegates, who came, who was the head of one of the factions in Argentina, who had the responsibility of choosing the players and directing the team in Uruguay, etc., made like a bomb, like declaration saying, the military were, like pointing at us with guns when we were playing. It was impossible to play, and this is why we lost. So that was amplified by Crítica and other papers in Argentina after these declarations. So nobody said anything when the match happened, but 2 days later there was like a concerted, effort, or I don't know, like a decision made to say this and justify the loss in the eyes of a very inflamed, Argentine part of the people in Buenos Aires. Actually, Nolo Ferreira, that was the center forward, a great player from Estudiantes, who was not part of that faction, who was a player that was included but made part of other faction, would contradict Ruquet and said, well, nothing happened. I mean, we lost. That's it. It was a fine play, etc. And we could have won, but, it's football and we lost. So many papers, some papers in Argentina, La Nación, etc., reflected what happened and said, well, it was just a football match. But what some papers are doing, that is like creating like violence by saying that it was all irregular, etc., is like a crime. So they should not do this because Argentina is already very, divided, etc. So this is not helping anyone. And of course, from the Uruguayan side, there's many chronicles, happy because of the victory, etc. But nobody would say that there was particularly violent, for example, the match. A Chilean journalist for El Mercurio in Chile would say the same. So everyone would agree that it was like a normal match. Then, like 50 years later, there is this very young guy back then. What is the name? Varallo, who was the right insider for Argentina, a very nice player from Boca Juniors, who would make some declarations like in the 70s. Okay, so 40 years later, saying that it was the match was very violent and the Uruguayans won because they were more men, and the Argentinians were scared by them, which it's his word only, and very, very after the facts. And I could discuss why this kind of ideology of Uruguayan football being, like based on force or even on like some sort of bullies. This was something created in the 60s. It has nothing to do with the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. All these years, when Uruguay actually won, it was because it was good players and very high quality football. It had nothing to do with violence, even though violence was part of football everywhere, always some level, of violence, but by no means nobody of the people watching Uruguay playing in the 20s and 30s would say that it was because of that or that Uruguay was particularly violent. It's more the other way around, especially in Europe. For instance, the match Uruguay-Germany in 28 was very violent on the part of Germany, and then Uruguay responded, etc. So it was, it is what this myth that I think it was useful for other teams in the 60s and 70s in order to, that contributed to isolate, Uruguay that had a lousy football especially in the 80s and the 70s. And so the idea kind of got some strength, and it was also used internally between the main teams in Uruguay in order to diminish, the what happened in the 20s and 30s because one of the teams was not part of it, etc. But this is like internal, discussions. But I would say that what happened in the field, well, the stadium was packed. Uruguay, Pablo Dorado, the lefty I said, playing in the right, did what he always did. That is, got a pass from Scaroni, and instead of going, open to the right, he got a diagonal into the goal and shot to the second post, and at the second, how do you say? Anyway, made like the first goal. Then Argentina paired and made this second goal, in offside or not. And then they went to the dressing rooms, and apparently Nasasi and the more experienced guys, had to talk to the team and say, okay, we cannot play this way. We have to win, etc. And Nasasi went to the referee dressing room and claimed, that it was an offside. The referee said, I'm sorry, but I didn't see it, and what can I do? And that was it. They returned. It was very, very, competitive game. And apparently Scaroni was like a magician again in the second half. Sea paired, as he always made the ties in the 24, 28, and 30. Every match Uruguay was losing in all these three tournaments, it was Jose Pedro Sea who would make the goal that tied the match. So it's incredible that this happened. And happened again. I got a pass from Scaroni and tied. And then Argentina could make the third. It was like anyone could make the third goal. And finally, there was this wonderful goal from 40 meters by Iriarte, the left winger, who got a ball, like a long ball, and prepared and shot to the angle and that was a 3-2. And then Argentina crumbled there. There was like 10, 15 minutes more to play. And finally, at the very last minute, Castro made a header, a goal with a header, and that was the fourth goal. Then everyone would go into the streets. Many Argentines who were in the stadium would walk all the city to the harbor in order to get to their ships and go back to Buenos Aires, mixed with the population. There was no violence. Nothing happened in the celebration. There was some violence in Buenos Aires, yes, against the Uruguayan consulate because the Argentines were like frustrated, but a few people, like a dozen people. So basically, that was it. And the referee, Langenu, the Belgian referee, this is what happened. He tells this. He tells this story. So his boat, his transatlantic, was going to depart at 3 p.m. But since he was the referee, he asked the captain to wait for him to delay the departure. So the captain accepted to delay the departure up to 5:30 or something like that. So he was escorted by the police when he got out of the stadium in order to reach the boat. This is what Langenu tells, right? I'm telling this because there was a myth that he, that was so partial in favor of Uruguay that had to be escorted by the police after he left, which is nonsense. So he left and arrived to the harbor, but only to realize that his ship could not depart because of the fog. So he had to make it back to the hotel and spend the night in Montevideo. So he joined the people, in the streets and tells about the celebrations, everything. And of course, it was the government declared that it was a holiday next day, so nobody worked. Everyone was drunk here and there, etc. So this is what happened. And then when L'Ingénieur went back to the harbor to take finally the ship and leave, his ship was arriving from Buenos Aires. This is why he couldn't board it, because it was not in the harbor because of the fog. So he arrived with all the people that had departed the previous day to go to the final, to assist the final, who couldn't make it. So he saw a lot of Argentine guys arriving in Montevideo after the fact, having learned by the radio that their team had lost, and it was a miserable scene, And anyway, so he finally boarded the ship, and with the French and the Belgium and other European teams, they all departed together back to Europe. So this is more or less the story. I mean, I don't think there's much more than this, but of course, because of what public opinion, the kind of public opinion that was created, especially in Buenos Aires, and the frustration and and all the turmoil, the political turmoil, etc., created this sort of breaking point with Argentina. There were families, who would not gather with each other for some time because of the bad blood, after the tournament. And I think Uruguayans felt that they had to, stop considering, this kind of closeness with Argentina the same as it was. There was a declaration of the Argentine Federation that they would not play Uruguay for never again or something like that. And this lasted like 3 years or something. Finally, it wouldn't last, but it was like a big deal at the moment. But it's football, and that was it. Nothing more than that.
And can you just discuss some of these players who've gone down in history as the first World Cup winners? The captain Nasazzi, Castro, Saya, Scaroni. Who are the players who are really remembered from that team?
Yeah, and I think Lorenzo Fernandez as well. The main structure of that team, you had Masali, who would not play in 1934 for what we said. So the keeper was Ballestrero, who was from Rambla Juniors. He was apparently very technical, very good technical, and in technical terms. And I don't have much to say about him, because Uruguay was not, except in the play with Argentina, was not very, like suffering in the back. Then you had Andrade, who did like a lousy tournament. He was not remembered as playing well against Argentina, never, even when he was in his prime. I don't know why, but this is what happened. And so he didn't make a very good tournament. Then you had Nasazzi, that is the captain, and he was a legend. He was a very fast player, against what people think that he was like a slow, big. He was a big guy, but very, very fast. In the statistics, he's the second fastest in the team. And he played. He was the first libero of world football. Probably, maybe in Great Britain you can find some similar, development tactically, but for sure Uruguay made use of the change in the offside law after 24, because Nasazzi would always send the other back, forward to break, the play, and he would wait and reach everyone. He was like this kind of player, and very, very strong with in the aerial, let's say, game. Then you have Mascheroni, who was like his partner, nothing special about him. Then you have, but there was something special with Tejera, that is the guy who played the first game. He was apparently a wonderful back, and he had been waiting for years to make his debut with the national team, because he was part of the other federation, so he would not be able to play when you remember the Uruguay was split, so players from Wanderers or Peñarol, etc., would not be able to play up to 25 when the thing was solved. But then in 28, he would not make it. I think he was, I don't remember if he was, he could not play or he was injured or whatever. So finally, he made the debut against Peru, and apparently it was very bad match he played. So he was taken out of the team, and Mascheroni would enter in his place, and he stayed. So Tejera was like a bluff, never reached finally the success he was expected from him. Then you have Estilo, wonderful player, very, cultivated guy as well. So he was a very important figure and great player, both in 28 and in 1930. He was from Peñarol. In 1930 already was playing for Peñarol. Then you have the center half. Lorenzo Fernandez was also a great player and important player in 1930. He was both technical and strong, very good in every aspect of the game. And because of the tactics of Uruguay, the center, in every team, I would say the center half would play a very important role. He was not the playmaker, but he would break, get the ball and pass it to the playmakers, who were Scarone, basically, and sometimes Sea. And the tactics of Uruguay was going juego de alas, as they would play in the sides, in the wings, with connecting, with the right wing and the center forward, and these kind of triangles that the Scottish actually created in the 1880s, was adopted by the Rio del Plata, teams, and they mastered it. So then you have the forwards. This is where we have more changes in 1930. Santos Urdinaran, who was the regular fixture, in 24 and 28, played only the first match and then was put out of the team. And Pablo Dorado, that was very young, almost a kid, said Scarone when he made his debut. Then he went on to play in Argentina. He was a fast player, not wonderful talent, but he was effective and very fast. And as I said, he was a lefty, so he had to compete with Iriarte, who was the left wing, and they decided to put Dorado on the right, and it worked. So he stayed for the other matches, and actually scored both against Yugoslavia and against Argentina. The first goal was Dorado. Then you have Scarone, who is the great player, and still, even though he was old, he was 30 years or 30 or 28 or something like that in 1930. He would play in his position. He only missed the first match against Peru because he was injured. He carried an injured, the very rebel injured for all these years. So he would be always, in doubt, but finally he played. And then you have Petrone, who was the usual player in 24 and 28, a big scorer. I think in terms of the number of minutes he played for Uruguay, he's the biggest Uruguay scorer of all times in terms of minutes played. But he was not in good form and in good shape, and he did not play more than the first match. So he was also substituted by Pellegrin Anselmo, was this dandy technical player in the center forward, who played wonderfully against Romania and Yugoslavia, and then he decided to not play the final. It's interesting because there's a wonderful photograph of him dressed up, from top to bottom with his best suit at the end of the final in the field with Castro, who played in his place, both hugging each other in front of the camera. So I don't know. It's curious and interesting that he resigned the possibility of playing and allowed Castro to play in his role. And Castro was a very brave, player, and he made the last goal. And he was important in the whole tournament. He scored the first goal and played in and out, but he had a very high spirits and a wonderful player as well. He was only one hand, so there's all sorts of legends about how he used the ramp, in order to, I don't know, win some advantage when he was jumping, for headers, etc. He was not very tall. He was a small guy. Then you have Jose Pedro Sea, El Vasco Sea, as he was called, that played. He was the only player who played all the matches from 28, 20, 24, 28, and 30. He played all of it, and was a very technical player as well, and had this angel about him that he would tie every match that was complicated. He would tie it. And then you have Iriarte, the left wing, who played all the games, very strong shoot, and he honored that with the third goal against Argentina in the final. There's a legend about him that he could not play with regular footballing shoes, because he could not support them, because he was used to play without shoes. So finally he managed to get a kind of like a very comfortable light shoes that looked like football shoes, but in reality were not. But he used that to play, and he played with that his whole career, apparently. So mixing some experienced guys, and I would say that the spine of the team would maintain the key names: Nasasi, Lorenzo Fernandez, Scarone, and then Sea, for the whole 3 championships. Then some other guys were mixed in, and it worked, basically. But the team, by the end, already in 24, some commentators say, well, this is like not a national team. This is like a club, because players know each other so well, and they are used to each other, etc. So there's a clear hierarchy in the team, etc. So this helped them to develop this campaign, I would say, of 3, apart from the Copa Americas that they won as well, in 23, 24, and 26. So they were like very successful, obviously the most successful generation in Uruguayan football anytime, by being intelligent with the way they organized themselves and kept the formation, making the changes they needed when they needed them.
Yes, a little more things about the players. Nasazi was nicknamed El Gran Mariscal, the Grand Marshal. As far as Hector Castro, who was nicknamed El Manco because of his cut arm. Apparently, when he was 13, his right hand was accidentally caught when he was using an electric saw. That's exactly the story, right? And Santos Iriarte, nicknamed Canario, would actually pass away shortly thereafter, like in 1938, from tuberculosis. He was only 36 when he passed away. And the trio of Andrade, Fernandez, and Gersido were nicknamed La Costilla Metálica.
La Cortina Metálica. La Cortina Metálica.
My apologies, yes. And you mentioned about Sia, who played every minute of the Olympics and the World Cup adventure. He was actually born in Spain, it appears. Yeah. And he later managed Uruguay in the 40s and even won the Copa America as a manager in 1942. And we have Hector Scarone, you mentioned. He was the oldest goal scorer at the World Cup. Like I think he was like 30th or 31st, 31 years old at the time. And he also managed Real Madrid in the 1950s for like one season.
And Barcelona.
Oh, Barcelona?
Barcelona, yeah.
Oh, I thought he managed Real Madrid. Okay. So
no, you're right. No. I'm sorry. My bad. I understood you said he played, because he went to play for Barcelona. Right. And then returned. There's a whole story about Scarone going to Barcelona and returning in order not to, because if he became professional in 26, he would lose the ability to play for national team according to the rules that nobody respected, but were part of the rules of FIFA. And so he decided to come back to Uruguay and not lose the possibility of playing for Uruguay. This is the story. I'm not totally sure of it, but this is what they say. There's a lot of, and then you're right. He went on to manage, I think, Real Madrid.
Right.
Yeah.
And Lorenzo Fernandez was also born in Spain, and he was nicknamed El Gallego.
Mm-hmm.
And Dorado was the youngest World Cup champion. I think he was 22 years old. And we all know the legend of Andrade. And you mentioned he had a poor World Cup. He came to prominence at the 1924 Olympics at Paris, and he became a big star and even stayed in Paris for some time. And unfortunately, he would have a sad end. And
very sad.
He passed away in the 1950s.
Some interesting stories about Andrade, and he was a wonderful player when he was in his prime in 24. Having a very, spirited and mercurial temperament. He was both, I would say, a star in the night of Paris in 24. And all the players stayed like for a month after the tournament, basically, staying there in Paris and going out and for parties and etc., being part of the nightlife of Paris, like a fixture of the nightlife of Paris for some time. And then, they all returned. And then when Andrade was playing for Nacional after 24, and Nacional created like a big tour. They toured all Europe for months and months and played all teams, in 5 or 6 countries in Europe. And Andrade went on with Nacional to that tour. And he then realized he was sick, as I said, and he had syphilis, it was treated, etc., but apparently was not cured completely. And he returned and played for Nacional in these years up to 1930. But back already in 28, 29, in 29, especially 30, he was already having, conflicts with the managers in Nacional. The managers would even refuse to pay him because he would not present himself for practice. He would not play sometimes, etc. So he was unreliable already. So this is what created all the turmoil in 1930 with his inclusion in the team. But the team supported him and he played. And then after that, he would, his career went down. There was a public instance that eroded, let's say, destroyed, I would say, his image in the eyes of the public, because at some point his family and his mother, etc., would plan, to create a public celebration for him when he returned from 24, and he simply did not show up, Andrade. Okay, so he decided to go to other place, etc. So that was like a big offense, and everyone knew because he was a high public figure. So he was conflicting figure in Uruguay. And then when he was really sick already in the early 30s, in 35, I think it was, there was a how can I say, like a thing organized in order to raise money for him, a match actually, and there was very few assistants. So, and that was another signal, that he fell out of like recognition in the part of the public because of his his way of his whatever. It's unfortunate. This is what happened. And then he and his days in an asylum, in a hospital first, and then even not in a hospital, but in an asylum where a German journalists came to Uruguay and interviewed him. And there's a huge story about it. I mean, a shocking story about his shape, how he was. He was blind, etc. And he died in the 50s out of many factors. But this is the sad story of this great player in 24, right?
Yes. So, in closing, describe the significance of this 1930 World Cup for the Uruguayan culture as a whole.
Well, of course, I think this was like for the Uruguayan culture was like the confirmation that football was like a very central part of the, let's say, of the national image. It's possible. I don't think it's very risky to say that Uruguay is known in the world mostly because of football. And then there are many other factors, I think, much more interesting than football that would make, worth to know something about Uruguay. But football was the thing that really created that, that people, since football is so popular, people all over the world would know the name, hear the name Uruguay and at least know a little bit about it. This is one obvious thing. I mean, I don't have to say it. Then you have that the final, mature, let's say, state in the relation with Argentina was achieved around 1930 because of many factors, probably economic, political, cultural factors. The growth of both countries, they started growing apart at some point at the beginning of the century. But the World Cup and all that happened, especially in Buenos Aires, was like the last drop, that finally made more overtly conscious for everyone that the rivalry with Argentina was very, very strong. And then you have, in terms of political terms, after the tournament in Argentina, there was a military coup in September 6th, 1930, so 1 month after the cup. That was, the conclusion of all this atmosphere that I was mentioning before. In Uruguay, the political stability was a little bit more stable up to a couple of years later, that there was another, interruption of the norm. I wouldn't say a military coup because it was not that, but there was the interruption of the normal, institutional working of democracy for some years. There was a little violence, but it was not very, terrible. And it lasted much less than in Argentina. But in Argentina, the military era, let's say, started in 1930, and you can argue that it ended with some interruptions much later, right? In 45 with Perón, and some people argue that it was, never ended until, 83. So there was like a lot of no consequences of the cup, of course, but the cup was at some kind of turning point for the institutional and social, I would say, functioning of Argentina in particular. And for Uruguay, it was the confirmation of the big, era of the 20s. And before the teens and even the first decade of the century were very golden, times for Uruguay in many respects. And football seemed to confirm that, seemed to, how can I say, to confirm and stabilize this kind of narration about the country. And then, Uruguay didn't play in 34 and 38. Then there was no more cups up to 1950 in Brazil. And Uruguay would go and would win in 1950 again. So it was kind of very strange and difficult to to think different for Uruguayans, that they were invincible because they they played 24, 28, 30 and then 50, and they won all of them, and they had never lost a match in this level until I don't remember when exactly, but it was, I think, 60.
No, 1954 against Hungary, probably.
You're right. 54 against Hungary in the semifinal. So that was the very first match Uruguay lost in extended time in a World Cup, right? So this kind of became a legend that I think did some good for Uruguayan football, of course, but at the same time also created some troubles, because when you were not able to sustain that quality because of many different reasons, you lost, some generation is not as good as the previous, the economics of football changed, etc. Uruguayans were not able, in my judgment, to change their mind, about what was the cause of now they're losing, in the 70s and 80s. And they started attributing their losses to all sorts of strange things, and not to the simple thing that is, well, you're not playing that good anymore. You're not that competitive anymore. So I think when Tavares came around in 2006, he had this story that I'm telling, he had it very clear in his mind, because somehow in the memory of footballers and in the consciousness of professionals, this story that I'm telling was always very clear, that they were better and then they were not as good. So this is the main reason. And they had to recover, these kind of roots of quality of football. And this is what Tavares tried to do, recover discipline and quality. And eliminating, the idea that if you are violent and if you are, streetwise, whatever, you're going to win. No, that's stupid. You're not going to win. And you're going to be rejected by the whole world, which is what happened to Uruguay in the 80s, especially, because they had lost the way, So I think this is how I understand the story. This is how my grandfather, etc., would tell the story to me as well, because it's something that everyone in Uruguay would somehow know. And it was replaced by an ugly story of, we won because we're more men, than the others, which is wrong. It's very wrong. So, of course, Uruguayans are brave, as many other teams are. Many other teams are, able to fight, to not give any match, for lost until it ends. I think England is like that. Germany is like that. Italy is like that. Spain. I can mention many teams who have the same. Argentina, for sure. So it's not that. This is not the reason. The reason is that Uruguay had a high quality style and players, and this is what gave them their edge. So when they tried to recover that, everyone saw that in 2010, 14, 18, etc., with the help of a generation of talented players, Uruguay was competitive again. I don't think it's able to win the World Cup, because many factors would not help Uruguay to do that. But it can be a decent team, and be competitive as it is now. So I think this is the main, how can I say, the main lesson from all this story, to me at least. And I think that Tavares would approve of this. I don't know him personally, by the way, but I know about him. And I know how this knowledge would pass from the generation of Scarone and Nasasi to the generation of the people from the 50s. And then these guys of the 50s would pass it to the people in the 60s and in the 80s. And Tavares was a player in the 70s. So he received this, wisdom, let's say, directly in the dressing room. But the press was on a different course. They were going, to my opinion, in the wrong direction, very wrong, in the 80s and 90s, speaking about the garra, charrua, and all this idiocy. To me, it doesn't exist, simply. I mean, it's nothing important. Yes, Uruguay won some games, like in the last spell, as any other team did. So I don't see there's anything particularly unique about that. In Uruguay, I know that my fellow countrymen would many of them would say, well, no, this is not the case. We are the garra, is the explanation. No, it's not. To me, it's not. I'm a football historian. I've read everything really, and especially paid attention to not Uruguayan, commentators, but foreign commentators. And I think they tell the story much more, in much clear ways. And I think players know this, especially this generation, Lugano, Godin, Suarez, etc. They know this very explicitly, And Lugano particularly, who is, the head of that generation, would say it, declare it openly many times. So yes, Garra is important, but we had to be good players and have good tactics and be, good rivals to our fellow, players of the other teams. This is the way. Okay.
With that, we'd like to thank you for your participation in these interviews. And for any questions and comments, you may contact me on my blog, on Twitter. I'm at SP1873, and on Facebook, I'm under Soccer Nostalgia. Mr. Paul Whittle can be contacted on Twitter at 1888 Letter, and his blog is the 1888 Letter. You may also follow the podcast on Spotify and now on Google, Apple, and Stitcher podcasts, all under Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. Please leave a review, rate, and subscribe if you like the podcast. Mr. Mazzucchelli's contact information and the link to his book is also listed. And all this information is listed on the blog and podcast listings. So, Aldo, thank you once again, and hope to see you again for another Uruguayan topic in the future.
Thank both of you. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you for taking us back into football history.
Thank you.